Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Off the Map conversation of the Unscaled Travel Show. Today, we're going to take a closer look at one of the most famous icons to come out of that legendary battle of the Alamo in 1836, one David Crockett, right? Everyone kind of knows who that guy is, at least in part. So we're going to kind of tear into and separate the man from the myth. David Crockett on the surface level, right? Frontiersman, politician, soldier, and larger than life folk hero, especially to the people in Texas. Most people probably picture him in the famous coonskin-cap, thanks to Disney's 1950s portrayal that turned him more into a pop culture icon. So to help us sort all of this out, today we're joined by Alan J. Wiener. Alan is a cultural historian and author whose work explores the unexpected intersections of pop culture, politics, and untold stories of American legends. So you see why he's a perfect fit for Unscaled, right? His books include David Crockett in Texas, His Search for the New Land, which we will discuss, Channeling Elvis, How Television Saved the King of Rock and Roll, which is on my next to read list, and The Beatles' Ultimate Recording Guide. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Most people probably know, if they've heard the name, they think they know Davy Crockett. But, you know, the King of the Wild Frontier, and if I start singing lyrics from that song, it'll be stuck in all of our heads all day long. Nobody wants that. So let's start out with just diving right into how much of that image is real and how much of that is pure myth.
A lot of it is myth, of course, but there is some basis to it. He clearly was an outdoorsman. He was an accomplished hunter. He really was a soldier who fought in the Creek War and served in other military positions. He was an adventurer. He loved to be outdoors, but most of it is basically the myth. And the myth really began in his own lifetime. He even helped to create it himself with some of these stories he would tell and jokes in the campaigns. And that was fine back home because it sort of endeared him to the people he represented. And by telling those kinds of stories, he was telling the kind of jokes and stories that they told. So it sort of said, yeah, this guy's one of us. He understands us. He's a good guy to represent us. So that's fine as far as it goes. But as soon as he got out of Washington or got into Washington, and the press got hold of it and the publishing industry, it was taken, to no end of extremes that he never intended himself, and he kind of lost control of it. So that you saw stories in his own time in newspapers about him wading the Ohio or the Mississippi River with a tugboat on his back and wringing the tail off of a comet. He could get a raccoon to come down out of a tree just by grinning at him. These are the Davy stories, and it's all part of our mythology now. So, that part of it got beyond him, and I'm afraid that is the version that most people know and see. But I think it's important to note that that was also in his own time. There were songs written about Davy Crockett in his lifetime. There was a ballad of Davy Crockett that he may have known about himself. He saw himself portrayed on the stage in a play. He wrote his autobiography in 1834, which became an instant bestseller. He was sort of our first national humorist because the book is full of that sort of stuff. It's sort of like Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, but also it anticipates Mark Twain and Will Rogers and humorists like that, sort of man of the people sort of humor. And he went on a speaking tour to support that book, and crowds, thousands would show up to greet him all over the Northeast, as far west as Cincinnati. This tour went on for quite some time, and he was our first national celebrity. Everybody had heard of this guy. They knew who he was, and they wanted to come out and get a look at him. They would even come to see him in Washington and say, can I get in and get a look at him? Just, I don't know what they were expecting, and neither did he. He was kind of amused by all that. So you see how that thing sort of ran out of his control, but he tried to play it as best he could to his own advantage whenever he could, too.
And so you go into researching and writing a book or these books like this, probably with a certain idea of who this guy is, and then you start your research. So was there anything when you started breaking down the research in these letters and really deep diving into this man's history that you found really surprising from the myth to the actual man?
Yeah, there were a couple of real surprises, which of course don't lend themselves to mythology because they're relatively dull by comparison. The most surprising thing of all is that he was primarily a businessman. He was in politics, he was a soldier, but he spent most of his life, he was in Tennessee for 49 years before he went to Texas. And he spent much of that time elevating himself economically. He started out in poverty. He couldn't read or write till he was, I think, in his 20s. He self-educated himself, which shows you something about his ambition. That he always had. He always wanted to be a leader and apparently was a very natural leader. People looked to him for that. That's another thing that kind of surprised us. But it was this business of trying to buy land as much as he could, starting with, meager beginnings. And so all his life he was dealing in land, and you could buy land, you could sell it, you could make money on it, you could build businesses on it. He was also an entrepreneur who did start a lot of businesses and put buildings on them. He had mining properties. This isn't the stuff that Disney's going to put on television, right? So of course it's a surprise because you won't have found much of this about him.
Right.
The other thing was this business of leadership, because he's kind of played in the movies and television and in the pulp fiction as this aw shucks guy who, I'm in over my head in Congress and I'll tell jokes here because it entertains the guys on the floor and all of that. But that isn't who he was at all. When, as early as the Creek War, when he enlisted in 1813, he was made a sergeant to command the men who went out on patrols with him. And the men in those days, these citizen soldier armies, these volunteer groups, they elected their own leaders, their own officers, their own captains. So if the men were giving him this status, obviously they saw something in him, confidence as a leader that they were willing to follow, risk their necks for, right? This isn't a guy who, I like to say, was sitting on his porch all day shooting jackrabbits and swilling booze. He was a serious man.
What on earth would really drive him to Texas?
Well, first of all, a lot of people were going to Texas at the time. It was a place of opportunity. It was in chaos. It was in flux. The Texans were on the verge of beginning a war for independence from Mexico. There was a lot of unhappiness, a lot of issues being raised there. But for Crockett, there are two main reasons he went there. I've described what his pursuit of land was like in Tennessee. And this is something he never really gave up on. He didn't have much luck at it. He ended up losing most of the land he had accumulated through a disaster to a mill he had built and borrowed heavily to build it. And it was washed out in a flood almost as soon as he opened it. So he never got the income from it that he hoped to use to pay off his debts. Instead, he ended up having to sell, really, I think, all the land he had accumulated over those 15 years in Tennessee to pay off the debts, which is also to his credit, because the other option for people in that spot in those days was that you just skipped town and you didn't pay off your creditors because you couldn't. And he could have done that. And he, even in his autobiography, describes how some people or some people's wives would tell them to do that. And he was very happy that his wife told him to do quite the opposite. She was a great support to him. And she said, just sell it all, pay off your debts, everyone will be happy, and we'll just start over. And that's what he did. But here was Texas offering literally thousands of acres for practically nothing, especially if you were willing to bring your families there. And he had heard about it. He was not new to this issue. He hadn't been there, but he had good friends who lived in Texas and had for a while, who owned land there. And so he knew exactly where he wanted to go, and that was the land he wanted to explore. So he's looking to extend into Texas the land business he's been trying to build in Tennessee. He sees this as a far greater opportunity for him than he's finding in Tennessee anymore. So that was reason number one. The other reason is political. He was becoming very disillusioned about the future of the United States under Andrew Jackson. He thought that a personality cult had risen around Jackson, who was a very popular president, and that people were willing to go along with anything Jackson did simply because he was Jackson. I mean, we've seen charismatic presidents like this in the past who carried the public along with him. I guess that's the mark of a successful president, really. But Crockett was afraid of that because it meant that people like him wouldn't be able to pursue their own agendas if they crossed Jackson's. Plus, he often disagreed with Jackson just on principle. He opposed his Indian removal policy, his removal of the federal funds from the Second Bank of the United States. If people are going to go along with this guy, we're going to lose our democracy. There's, people are taking the yoke of bondage. That's how he put it. And he said the last straw for him really was this guy, Martin Van Buren. He really hated Martin Van Buren. He didn't like Jackson. He grew out of favor with Jackson. He grew to dislike him and disapprove of him. He thought that he was getting senile at the end. But with Van Buren, he just despised the guy. And Jackson had designated Van Buren as his successor. He was already vice president. And Jackson said, this is the guy I want to get the nomination and to be our next president. Well, as Crockett pointed out, if Jackson said that, you could pretty much bet Van Buren was going to be the next president. And in fact, of course, he was. And Crockett saw that coming. And he wrote letters, these weren't just political, campaign hyperbole. These were letters he wrote to his son, to his best friends, saying, I have told you for years that if Martin Van Buren becomes president, I will leave the United States. I will go to the wilds of Texas. I think Santa Anna's kingdom will be a paradise compared to this. He said these things.
In those, I guess, weeks, days before the Alamo, very quickly, what brought him to, what was his reasoning to join up with this cause at the Alamo, especially when, like you just mentioned, he was pretty brand new to the state.
Well, this carries forward from his whole mission there to find this new land. Right. What happened was he went up to the Red River country, and he did explore for about a month, most of the month or all the month of December, 1835. And he found what he was looking for. He saw the promised land. Everywhere he went, he saw exactly what he wanted. This land was priceless, and he loved the place. And what he would have wanted to do would be to stake out a certain amount of acreage, because he knew he would be entitled to, a certain number of acres, and to kind of file a claim on it somewhere so that land would be reserved for him, and then go back and get his family and move there. He wasn't interested in the war. He did not go there to join the war. He was aware of it. He sympathized with it, I'm sure, but that was not his primary reason for going there.
Right.
But now, just as he never had any luck. The poor guy just seemed to have a cloud over his head all the time. He gets there, he finds the land he's been looking for all his life, and one of the very few sensible things that the provisional government of Texas did, which was really kind of a very inefficient government, to be kind about it, was to close all the land offices for the duration of the war. The reason was there was already a lot of shady land speculating going on. So he had a choice of joining the army. That was the way you could get the land. If you joined in the war effort, there was thousands of acres to be had as bounties for joining, and all the men who enlisted knew that. Most of the men who died in the Alamo knew that too. And so his options were kind of, limited. He could have gone home and told his wife this is what he had agreed to do, and say, look, I found the land we want, but I can't claim any of it. But if I join the army, dear, then I'll get the land. By the time he did all that and got back to Texas, the war would probably be over, and he would have lost his chance at it. So this is what's going through Crockett's head at the time. He sees this big opportunity that he's finally got. And what's the price? Well, I love this land, and now I'm going to have to fight for it. And he was willing to do that.
So we're at the Alamo, and this is where a lot of the current myth and figures, because there's been all kinds of movies and television shows about the Alamo and the actions.
Hollywood has a lot to answer for.
Hollywood never let the truth get in the way of a good story, right? So True. What does your research and everything say about his actions within the Alamo itself? What did he actually do? I mean, I know he wasn't winking at raccoons to get them coming out of trees and things there. So what was he actually doing inside the Alamo within the battle?
He's exercising leadership. Travis, who is only 26 years old, really sees the leadership qualities in this guy, and he sees how much respect the men have for him. We have one example that's in a letter Travis wrote himself early in the siege. There were some wooden buildings near the Alamo that the Mexicans had occupied and placed them very close. They would have very close access to fire on the soldiers in the Alamo. So Travis wanted them driven out, and he wanted the buildings burned. So Crockett was chosen to lead this squad of men who went out to do that. And we know from Travis's report that the action went on for about 2 hours. There was cannon fire from both sides, small arms fire. There were casualties among the Mexicans. They suffered a few deaths and injured. The Texans, I think, had a couple of minor scratches. But the point is that Crockett led. And in his report that night to Sam Houston, Travis made sure that he mentioned the Honorable David Crockett was seen at all points directing the men to do their duty. So that kind of tells us what he was doing in the Alamo. And it also gave Travis a way to remind these people who he's begging for help, I've got the most famous guy in America here under my command, okay?
Exactly. It's like if Prince would have been there, it'd been like, Colonel Prince was riffing on the guitar and keeping morale high. So don't forget, we have this guy here. What actually happened to David Crockett at the end of the battle? Can you shed a little light on that?
Very little, actually. Although I devoted a whole chapter, a long one, in the book to that very question, because I kind of didn't want to get involved in that, but you can't write a book about David Crockett in Texas and not talk about how he was killed at the Alamo. There are, as you say, a number of different versions. There is really no reliable eyewitness account of his death on the Texan side.
Right.
There are people who say they saw his body afterward. And based on the location of his body or the condition or how many dead Mexicans they say were around him, they drew the conclusions they did. There are at least 5 Mexican written accounts that give the other version that you mentioned, that he was captured, surrendered, whatever, and executed. And I go through all of those in great detail in the book, explaining why I did not find them credible and the reasons why. And I'm not going to go the next 40 minutes explaining where those reports came from, but that's key to the story. Where did they actually originate? Where did they first appear? How did they go from one party to the next till they became almost, it reads almost to me like a staged movie scene with dialogue and with, heroes and villains. And by the time those stories came out, they came from the Mexicans, because the Mexicans despised Santa Anna by that point. They blamed him for losing the war, then trading Texas in exchange for his life after San Jacinto when he was taken prisoner. And for this, we lost. So they're trying to make him look as evil as they can. And the Mexican prisoners in Galveston after San Jacinto are really in terror of their lives. The Texans are very angry. And so I think I'm sort of, hypothesizing here, but I suspect what happened was that a lot of the Texans, in speaking to the Mexicans, wanted to know about the Alamo. They wanted to know about Goliad. They wanted to know, did you see Crockett? For some reason, they would have thought maybe they knew who Crockett was. They had no idea who he was, who Crockett was. So, but the word got around camp. This is one possible scenario, that they're interested in this guy Crockett. They're really upset about him. Let's tell them Santa Anna killed him. They'll get off our backs. I mean, I'm really dumbing this down and oversimplifying, but I think something like that kind of game of telegraph or telephone happened. And those first reports of Crockett surrendering did come out of Galveston. They came out only a few months after San Jacinto, and they appeared in newspapers, one in Detroit, one in New York, and they're virtually identical. That's the other thing that makes me suspicious. All of these versions, including the ones that came later from the Mexican officers, are so alike. It's like somebody staged this scene, and they had an agenda. Right. I mean, for one thing, they all say that General Castrillon was the one who tried to rescue Crockett, that he found these 5 or 6 or 7 men and urged them to surrender because they were the last men in the Alamo, and it was pointless to resist anymore. And so they agreed to surrender, and he would try to save their lives. None of them could speak Spanish. He couldn't speak English. So I'm wondering how all this happened. The place was in total chaos by the end of the battle. I mean, Mexicans, imagine all the pent up fear and frustration that they must have going into this battle. And now they've really won the battle. They're killing these men. They went around shooting the dead. They shot a cat that they claimed was an American. There was no controlling these men at this point. And yet these stories would have you believe that Castrillon throws up his hands. Wait, stop. We're going to not kill these 4 or 5 or whatever.
Yeah.
Here. And why the hell would he do it? They were his enemies. He was supposed to be there to kill them too. He was a lifelong soldier. Well, by the time the stories came out, Castrillon was dead. He was killed at San Jacinto. He left no memoirs, no recollection of the Alamo. He couldn't deny the story, so he's a convenient guy to use for this too. I mean, a lot of this, I'm putting this together based on what little tidbits we have of information. At the end of that chapter, and I'll tell you the same thing, I don't think we'll ever have a definitive answer to that question. I weighed what I weighed based on where his body was located, and there were 2 versions of that. The one has him placed in front of what is now left of the Alamo, the church building. And that was from Mrs. Dickinson, Susanna Dickinson, who was one of the civilian survivors, who claimed to have seen his body there in front of that. She gave that story 40 years after the battle. She never mentioned it earlier than that. She was herself illiterate, as were almost all the survivors in the Alamo. So they didn't write anything of their own. They were responding to other people's questions during interviews, at testimony they gave at hearings where they were certifying that certain men had been in the Alamo and therefore their descendants were entitled to the land grants they got. They called on people like Mrs. Dickinson to verify the men had been there, and she would do that. And in one of those testimonies, she's quoted as saying about Crockett, she said he was in the Alamo and I believe he was killed there. And then, 40 years after the fact, who knows how many probing or, leading questions she was asked by these people. Well, did you see his body? Wasn't he? And by that time, the Alamo, all that exists of the Alamo is that church building. By now, most of it's been torn down. And so when people think of the Alamo, as they do today, they think of that building. So, I saw him killed at the Alamo. The Alamo, well, he was right in front of the church, right? Somebody might have suggested that to her, and who knows? I mean, what the woman went through, I really wouldn't want to go through. I mean, she must have been so traumatized by the end. Her husband was killed literally outside the room she was staying in, inside the church. So, I don't fault her for anything. I'm not trying to say she's a liar or anything like that. But the other version comes from the alcalde or mayor of San Antonio, Francisco Ruiz, who didn't have any agenda here. He didn't have, an axe to grind in this. He's basically a government official. He's been ordered by Santa Anna to bring men and carts from the town to collect all the Alamo dead, the Texans, and assemble their bodies for burning and on funeral pyres.
Right.
So he does it. But Santa Anna also asked to identify the 3 ringleaders, Crockett, Travis, and Bowie. He wants to make sure they're dead, I suppose. So Ruiz, in his reports, very matter of fact, like a government bureaucrat, doesn't make himself the center of the story, doesn't really have any great interest in these things, correctly identifies the location of Bowie's body in the southern building at the low barrack near the entry gate, Travis at the north wall, where we know he was killed, and he says to the west of where Travis was killed, we found Crockett's body. Now, right to the west of where Travis was killed, along in the northwest, is a cannon emplacement. And that's where he's saying he found him. So I found his version just more credible for what, because he doesn't have a reason for saying that. And what happened on the morning of the battle? All the Mexican soldiers, except about 130 of them, attacked the north wall. They originally started from 3 different positions. One group at the east was pushed further north by the Alamo cannon that were being fired from the church. And so you end up with 1,500 men, roughly, all concentrated at the north wall very, very quickly early in the battle. So if you're one of the handful of men in the Alamo, they only had about 150 to 180 effectives. Where are you going to go? Right. You're going to run to the north wall. That's why Travis went there. He didn't have an assigned post or anything. That's where the fighting was. That's where the attack was coming from. He raced up there. I'm assuming Crockett and all the rest of them that could do it also did it. There were very few left at the southern end where Morales's group entered. They took the southwest corner and took the cannon and killed the few soldiers that were down there. and in the entry gate area where the lunette was, and quickly secured the southern end of the fort. In fact, they secured it so well that they started advancing north as the Mexicans were coming over the north wall, and a lot of the Mexicans ended up shooting each other coming from those two directions. So some of their casualties came from that. But if that's where Ruiz says he found Crockett's body, and that's where I think almost all the Texans would have been, that has a lot more credibility to it than a lot of these other versions to me. But as I say, I emphasize the information could be a lot more definitive, and we may never know. I think that he died in the Alamo is all we really need to know, don't we?
For people that are visiting the Alamo or plan to visit the Alamo or any Davy Crockett sites today, in your opinion, what should they keep in mind if they want to understand the man and not just the myth? Is there anything that they should, I don't know, just keep at the forefront of the memory about who this guy actually was when they visit these sites?
It's hard to do that because obviously the sites are built around whatever happened there, and the Alamo is what happened at the Alamo. But I understand they're doing a lot in the way of expanding the educational facets at the Alamo, the aspects. There's going to be a new huge museum, apparently. There are education centers. There was already a lot more there around 2010, I think was the last time I was there, than there had been the first time I visited the Alamo, which was in 1961. There was practically nothing there. And I thought it was much more educated. There were like displays of paintings and depictions as you went through the ground saying, well, here's what was really here then. Because most of it's gone. It's very hard to appreciate what went on there when most of it's covered now by modern buildings and there's only that one small church building left. So I think they've come a long way. And from what I understand, they're going to come a lot further in doing this. So to the visitor, I would say, yes, definitely. I mean, you only have so much time to spend at historic sites. I've done a lot of traveling in the last 20 years around the world because all these places I've always wanted to see. And even in-depth tours can only cover so much. So right. Hopefully, you get something out of that about what was real as opposed to the legend. And then that hopefully will lead you to read on your own and get behind those stories a little bit with more detailed information. That's the one function I think Hollywood does serve and did serve in this case in 1955. It may not have been accurate, but it sure got us interested, and we started looking for books about Crockett. We wanted to know more about the real guy, and I'm still doing it here. This is like 70 years later. So I think it can serve that purpose regarding any historical event.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for your time and your insight and shedding a much needed light on a beloved figure in American history and Texas history. And if, before we let you go, if people want to follow along, if they want to pick up a copy of any of your books, how do they find you? How do people reach out to you?
Well, there's the website. Thank you for posting the website. And the books are available online. Through the website, you can link to the publisher and order the book that way, which is probably preferable. But there are, booksellers online, and there's still bookstores around. I'm surprised. I find them
Who
more
knew?
Frequently. Yeah, right. I mean, they were disappearing there for a while, but I actually am finding some. So you might be able to find the book there. It's being sold at the Alamo, I know, and at some of the other Crockett sites. So you shouldn't have any trouble finding it. If you actually wanted to communicate with me, I think there is a way to do that through the website, or you can write to the publisher or email the publisher, and the word will get to me, and I'll try my best to answer.
Alan, thank you so much again for your time and for all your research and hard work through these years. I guess those episodes when you were younger made an impression, and now we're all benefiting from that. So.
Yeah. Well, I'll leave you with one parting thought. Even though I've been spending all this time trying to rescue the real Crockett, who always seems to be about 50 yards behind Davy, I still watch the Fess Parker series every so often.
Do you put the coonskin cap on?
No, I never had one. I'm sorry to admit that, but I was never given one.
Well, you know what? I know what I'm getting you for Christmas.
Oh, thank you.